United Nations Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women has released a report in which it says South Africa has an obligation to better address domestic violence, and that failure to address domestic violence is a violation of women's rights. The committee found, among other things, that those who reported their abuser often did not get the protection they needed. It says official figures show that out of nearly 144,000 requests for protection orders in 2018 and 2019, only 22,200 were granted. Now, in many cases, the protection order just called for the abuser to sleep in a different room in the same house. Joining me now to talk about this is Regional Campaigns and Advocacy Specialist at Sonke Gender Justice, Piwa Mangwiro, founder of the TES Foundation, Mara Glini, researcher, and gender activist Lisa Vetten. Good evening to you, and thank you very much, ladies, for joining us tonight on In Focus to once again have a stab at this and see if we can certainly get something tangible that we can see bring about the change we want in society. Mara, let's begin with you. I mean, it is not a new thing, not a secret, not a revelation just coming out of the UN report that South Africa needs to do better to deal with gender-based violence. And we know this, we say this, and we put plans towards this, but we are not seeing that kind of result. I mean, horror statistics, horror reports, even this morning, of things that are happening to young girls, young children, and women in this country. Very clear that we need to tap into certain social change features that we are clearly not focusing on. Am I correct here?
Absolutely, and I think if we look at the number of orders that you quoted there, those will probably have been first-time orders and not final, because the protection orders are extremely tricky. Interim protection orders last for a very short while, a few weeks, and then they get renewed in front of the judge, and mostly they are turned down today. So we are finding more and more that women in our country are being denied access to legal assistance. One must just look at things like the backlog of the DNA. Thousands of cases, we are years in arrears with DNA. So what is the good of taking a person to the police, reporting a case, they have all the invasive tests to prove they were raped, and we can't get the DNA to go to court, so the perpetrators get off free. We have a very poor justice system supporting rape victims. Our legal system is letting them down, and sadly, so are the police.
Yeah. What do we do, Piwa, when the institutions, the basic institutions in society that are supposed to determine social behavior are failing?
It is really unfortunate that, as Mara has said, we are being failed by the institutions and the systems that are supposed to be protecting us as women in this country. And I think what we need to do, the unfair thing is that it continues to place the burden on us to say, what do we do? How do we carry the load? And we are already dealing with a lot. We are already dealing with living in fear for our lives and all that, and to then place that burden and again on us to say what we do is a very unfair situation that we find ourselves in. But we need to continue to hold the institutions and the systems accountable. We need to continue to demand that they meet their responsibilities, because the unfortunate and the painful thing is that when you look at the laws and you look at the policies, of course, there are some gaps that are being addressed, but in general, you go to different platforms and spaces, our country will be hailed as having some of the best legal mechanisms and all. Yet those mechanisms are not translating to changing the lives of many young women and many women and girls in this country. It's not translating to protecting us. And we have to be constantly thinking about what needs to be done. So we need to constantly think about how we hold decision makers accountable to implement the laws and the policies that they've committed to, but also for us to hold them accountable, to go into the root causes that, our laws may be reacting to the situation, but we also need to begin to really think about the preventative mechanisms, that how do we prevent violence? How do we shift our societal norms in the behavior and the patterns that that this violence is deeply embedded?
Yeah. Lisa, are the institutions interrelated in nature, right? So that if we change the behavior of one institution, right, if we agree on the rules of behavior for one institution, they will then affect all the other institutions. Is that what we believe will happen? So if we get law enforcement right, or if we get the justice system right in terms of our courts, we'll be able to get all the other institutions falling in line.
No, that isn't unfortunately correct. I think one of the difficulties that we are faced with is that you use the word criminal justice system, but it doesn't actually work like a system. It tends to work as a very isolated, separate and discrete part of the police and the courts and the prisons, and there might be no connection between them. And that translates into policy, if you want to think about it more broadly, that at this point in time, if you want help in South Africa with domestic violence, you pretty much are going to be willing to have your partner arrested and for him to go to jail. If you want any kind of financial assistance, if you want alternative housing, you're not going to get that. The only help you'll get is if you want your partner imprisoned. And I think if you listen to women and you ask what is it that they want, that is not the option all of them want. They want the violence to stop. And that's different from having him sent to prison. So I think part of the problem is that we've created these very small little solutions that aren't pegged to a much broader, comprehensive approach that would give women lots of different options that they could use and would recognize that different women want different things. And then having disconnected the different parts of a solution, we then disconnected the parts of a single solution like the criminal justice system. So you can get the police working, for instance, but if the courts aren't putting cases through, if they aren't giving women protection orders, if they're making women wait for months before protection orders are finalized, then the work that the police have done is basically undone. And of course, if there isn't a shelter for a woman to go to once she's had a protection order and is now too scared to go home because of how her partner will respond, then once again, you've only given her a quarter of a solution. So I think the challenge is to try to think comprehensively and in a big picture way rather than little things like let's focus on bail, but forget everything else that must happen for bail to be a meaningful intervention.
Yeah. When we continue a moment, how do we successfully integrate forces in society to change? Conversation continues tonight. How do we integrate forces in society for the social change we want to see? A change in value systems for South Africa to do better when it comes to dealing with gender-based violence. Mara, is there a model that we can borrow that has worked somewhere else in the world when it comes to social change, where everyone will agree on the rules of behavior, social organizations will be able to participate, bring in their resources and their knowledge and their know-how, and we change the value system in our society. Tell you what, every time we speak to politicians, because we put a lot of pressure on politicians because we believe maybe politics are what is going to change society. And they'll tell you, well, violence is a societal thing. We are generally a violent society, and hence it expresses itself in violence in schools and so forth, in the workplace and so on and so forth. So it's something that needs to change at a societal level. How do we integrate our forces in society?
Well, that's a great question, because one of the very important things for me is to go right back to the starting point. Organizations in this country don't always collaborate as I wish they would and as I believe they should. And one of the reasons is that the system that is in place currently for funding makes the few NGOs that work in the area of gender-based violence compete for the very limited funding that's available. So our first place, in my opinion, would be start not to have NGOs and organizations and academics like Lisa out there grappling for funds on a daily basis because there isn't enough money put into the research in this field and to helping women. And as Lisa correctly said, there aren't enough shelters, there aren't enough services. So our very first starting point is not to pay lip service to funding and make grand announcements that come to very little or naught, and that is to have adequate funding made available, because there are very good people in our country, and as you correctly said, possibly other models around the world. But I think we must remember that we are a very unique country. Africa is a unique continent, and we come with our own set of norms and standards, which are shaped by our past history, but also shaped by our cultural norms. And so we could not, in most cases, take a model from Australia and put it in here, because it wouldn't work. We have different norms. We have many languages. We deal with all of those things. So I think if we had enough funding granted to us together as a group of people, we're in an organization called Shukumisa, where there are, I think, 70 organizations in the gender-based violence field that work together. Both Lisa and Mapiwe are the organizations are members of that. And if we were given the correct funding, we'd work out a solution suitable for South Africa, because there is hope.
Piwa, I mean, the word funding itself changes meaning depending on what organization or what institution you're talking to, or the right funding, right? If you're talking to a certain political party, they'll tell you we spent 3.2 billion rands on gender-based violence, and they say this is enough, right? And others are saying, no, we've spoken to this private company, they'll be giving cars to be able to go to rural parts of South Africa to address issues of women and be able to drive them to wherever they need to be. And they say this is enough money that is being put into this. What is the right funding and adequate funding, and what are the economics that we need to be focusing on here?
Thank you for that. Well, in all honesty, I'm really sitting here and thinking, what is right funding? I think for me, what is right funding is the kind of funding that will translate to meaningful change for the realities of women and girls. Because as what Lisa has already said, we may be saying 3.2 billion has been given, but where has it gone to? Because if that 3.2 billion has not translated to services being available for the woman, for the young girl who is a victim of gender-based violence, then that means that there is something wrong with the way this funding has been structured, or if there is something wrong with the way the funding has been utilized, because ultimately it's not just about the figures, it's about the translation, the difference that these figures are going to make on the ground. And the reality is the institutions or the organizations, service organizations that are providing fundamental services to women and girls, institutions that are providing services and support to women and girls are still underfunded. It has taken such a battle for us to get to where we have the National Strategic Plan on GBVF. And all along the conversation that we've been saying is, where are the funds? The Domestic Violence Act came, and it was not costed. The Sexual Offences Act came, and it was not costed. So what we see is that constantly we have these policies that are not costed, and it's not clear. Well, they will talk about services have to be provided, shelters have to be provided, this has to be done, and there isn't the commitment that goes with those with the stipulations that are made in policy. And at the end of the day, if we try to really track to say where is that money going, you find that it is somehow caught up in the chain, and it eventually doesn't trickle down to what matters. So what matters is funding that is able to trickle down to the level where it is needed, to that young woman, to that vulnerable woman who needs the services that are supposed to be addressed. That's what meaningful funding would look like.
Lisa, the last time we were having this conversation at the top of August, we were talking about some of the short-term gains that maybe we could possibly talk about. One of the other number I heard earlier on today, that there are 30 shelters that have now been set up where, for example, victims of gender-based violence can at least go there for a period of 3 months, and there are 2 or 3 emergency ones where they can go there immediately for a period of like 3 weeks. Are those short-term gains negligible when we look at the big picture of what was promised and what we've managed to achieve so far?
I think what we're very good at is doing the same things over and over again. So I don't want to disagree that we don't need shelters. We certainly do. But we have never yet taken the much bigger step to ask, where do women go after they leave a shelter? Because they can't live in a shelter forever. We have never in 25 years seen any attempt to try to think about how domestic violence is a housing problem. And what does that mean for the way local government should be distributing its rental units, for example? What does it mean about how we negotiate with traditional leaders about giving women land when they live in rural areas and don't necessarily want to go into a shelter? We've yet to make that kind of step. We've yet to even think about things like, how does the Department of Health get more involved? How is it that we get doctors to the point of, instead of just stitching up women, giving them painkillers, sending them home for the 4th time that they've seen them in the last 8 months, how do we get them to start asking, what's happening at home? How are you? How do we get them to start giving women references to shelters or to counseling services? How do we get, so how do we start to expand beyond the same things we've always done, to start thinking about building in a health response, building in a response that looks at labor, that looks at job skills training and the like, that looks at health, and that most definitely starts to look at mental health. I mean, if you go into a rural area, there are very, very, very few psychiatrists. And for women who might need them, it will be months before they get any assistance. So I think that the challenge to us is not to keep on doing the same things that we've been doing for the last 25 years, which have helped, but I mean, there's just so far that they will take us, and to challenge ourselves to think in new and different ways. So that might even include things like, how can we get local government to play a much better role in terms of ensuring that public transport routes, which women must walk to every day, that they're lit, that there's security there, especially if women are having to walk to catch a train, say at 4 o'clock in the morning. How do we get to thinking about those kinds of interventions beyond what we usually do and think?
Right. And when you speak of mental health interventions, is it time, maybe? Is it the right conversation to have the mental health situation of the perpetrators themselves? We take them to rehabilitation centers, so to speak, and then release them again into society, hoping that they would have learned the lesson. Do we really get into their mental health and understand, or should we even be talking about that?
We should. Because I think there is enough research to suggest that we should take very seriously the fact that certainly some men, not all, do have serious difficulties with depression and anxiety at the time they perhaps assault their female partners. They come with those kinds of histories. It's not an excuse for what they do, but it does help us to understand what shapes their thinking, how it limits the possible options of emotional responses that they could have to a scenario. So, and there's also a very difficult problem in that women are very much more likely to seek help when they're struggling. Men don't. They go and drink, or they just keep quiet, and then it comes out in all sorts of ways that are not helpful. So I think there's a real challenge just to think about, how do we, A, make looking